thank you very much. I was in Dallas yesterday, and I was talking to some folks there about my 15 minutes of fame and the book writing process. And I thought an apt illustration was the fact that on last Friday I was on the Today Show, or had been invited to be on the Today Show, which was an unusual event for me. And it got even stranger and more unusual when I was there, because I got escorted into the famous green room, which isn't green, by the way, and was told that I was going to be booked before the segment on the world's largest giant squid. And so, so much for glamorous publishing. I met with George W. in May and June of last year on 2 different occasions, mainly to tell him that I was doing a book about him. And he's a very casual guy. I don't know if many folks here have had a chance to meet him. He's a very intense and casual guy. He plopped his boots up on the desk, these very almost intimidating $2,500 eelskin boots. He plopped them up on the desk and said, "Billy boy, what are you up to?" It's one of his nicknames for me. I'll tell you about the other nickname that he eventually developed for me over time. And I told him I want to do a book about you, Governor. I think that you are a pretty interesting guy. This is a pretty interesting state. It's a very merry, fractious, oftentimes over-the-top kind of place to live. I've been here 21 years myself. And like Governor Bush, I'm a transplanted Northeasterner. I'm from New York. He was born in New Haven, Connecticut. Anyway, I told him, look, Texas is very interesting. I think you'd agree with me on that level. And also, your last name happens to be Bush, and you come from a very potent and powerful political dynasty. And really, in my estimation, I think your family has surpassed the Kennedys as the most powerful political dynasty in America in this century. And he said, well, let me think about whether or not I want to, help you or cooperate with you, really, and come back and see me in a couple of weeks. I came back to see him in a couple of weeks. And that was a more interesting and intense meeting with Governor Bush. I kind of saw the full range of stripes that I don't think a lot of us normally see as he's out campaigning and even, acting as governor. I saw him in a little more up close and personal way. He was angry at me at our second meeting because he had begun to discern that I had begun the kind of the wheels of inquiry into his life, and I think he felt a little uncomfortable with that the process had begun almost outside of his control in a way. And so we had a very freewheeling, interesting discussion, and again, I saw the full range of emotions from George W. A little bit angry, which I learned later is sometimes one of his character traits. He can get angry at you. He can be explosive, a little bit of a Mount Vesuvius, frankly, at times. And it's something that he's worked a lot at tamping down in his life and trying to control. And then he was very cajoling, very funny, very irreverent. Some colorful language was spoken. A real, interesting, intense encounter. And basically he said, let me think about really whether or not I need to think some more whether we're going to cooperate with you and talk to you. And then he said, pull out your notebook. I had already had out my notebook. I had a sneaking suspicion this might be the last time I would see him. So I wanted to make sure that every moment that we had together I could capture, and I feverishly taking notes anyway. He said, let me give you some names of people to talk to. And he mentioned a real variety of folks, some of whom I'd already known to talk to. These were some of his best friends, people who had been interviewed before about his life. And then he gave me the name of his Little League coach, which I thought was kind of interesting. He gave me the name of his personal accountant, which I thought was also interesting. It's kind of an odd variety. And so I kind of took it as almost a green light. I think George W., in some sense, was giving me a little bit of a green light to look at his life, while he still contemplated whether or not he actually was going to talk to me himself. I went home and a few weeks later, began calling some of the folks that he had mentioned, including his Little League coach, and that was a pretty interesting conversation. The guy out in, it's an elderly gentleman out in West Texas named Frank Ittner, and he told me that George W. was really one of the worst Little League players that he coached. And I didn't read too much into that. I don't know if that's symbolic or not, but it sort of became symbolic over time for me. what the Little League coach told me was he was a player. He was always in on every play, but he certainly wasn't the player that his father was. And when he told me that, it kind of rested in the back of my mind, and I wrote it down. I thought about it, and it kind of went away. But as the book kind of progressed, and I began looking, more at George W.'s life, it actually seemed very, very symbolic to me of a lot of things in George W.'s life. That for him, in almost every phase of his life, he's walked in his father's shadow. This enormous, gigantic political legacy and dynasty that exists. And again, a family that I maintain has surpassed the Kennedys in some ways. I didn't really understand until I began this process how closely George W.'s life had emulated his father's, and how he had been affected by this enormous, incredibly enormous shadow. And a lot of people are surprised when I use the word Shakespearean when I talk about George W. He might tell you that I'm, speaking as George W., I'm the last guy to read Shakespeare, or maybe even like Shakespeare. He might argue that, and some of his critics would certainly argue that, but as well. But to me, he's a guy that's really burdened by an enormous legacy and a mantle of expectations. And I kind of began to like that idea, because I'm not an acutely political writer by nature or really by career. In the 21 years that I've been in Texas and writing, I've worked at a variety of newspapers. I've written for a number of national magazines, and by and large, the stories that I've written, or the ones that I've liked to write, have been more about human nature, human interest, and almost really an interior look at people, if you will. George W. calls it psychobabble, by the way. And I had kind of suggested to him when we first met that that's where I was headed. I think that explained a little bit of his caution in meeting with me. I wasn't a traditional political writer, and I think he was a little bit worried about that. He uses this word again, psychobabble, and when he says it, it rolls off his tongue like the worst curse imaginable. It's really an anathema. It's psychobabble. And he gets very worked up and exercised about it. He also says, as his father says, don't lay me out on the couch. In other words, don't psychoanalyze me. Don't go there. What you see is what you get. I'm a pretty exterior person, so don't go looking for that deep interior. And besides, I'm not going to ever tell you about it. We keep it very private. We keep a stiff upper lip in almost a kind of a patrician, upper northeast kind of way. But I guess I was hell-bent on doing that because I didn't know any better. And so I began kind of looking at the interior of George W. And some people have said, this probably will sound like a sales job, but some people have told me that this book seems almost strangely non-political since it's about an acutely political guy. And that actually pleases me to hear that. And, perhaps even more flattering to me, of course, is the thought that some people have said it's almost novelistic in a way. And I've been criticized for that, frankly, in some reviews that have come out already. I've been praised in some reviews, but also criticized for taking that approach. But I thought that was the right way to go. It's not an Edmund Morris way. I didn't probably go that far to the point of inventing a persona or person to walk alongside George W. through his life and times. But I really tried to take a different look at him through a different kind of a prism, and really the only prism that I felt comfortable with, and that was through a very acutely human and almost psychological or psychobabble way, to use George W.'s word. I learned one thing about George W. right off the bat as I began looking at his life chronologically, that at the age of 7, it's a little told story in the Bush household. I think it's little told because they don't share a lot of their inner workings and their inner personal stories, or their inner tragedies, I guess you'd say. That at the age of 7, when George W. was 7, his younger sister Robin contracted leukemia, developed leukemia, and died several months later. I didn't know about that. And what happened in that instance was that George W., in my opinion, was almost rendered an only child in the family, and in a lot of ways was smothered by Barbara Bush. and he was then 7 years older than his brother Jeb, and I think that's had a really lasting impact on him. This is getting into a deep psychobabble area that I think George W. would feel uncomfortable with. But I talked to a lot of people in the family, a lot of his close relatives. I spoke to his brother Jeb, who consented to a lengthy interview. I spoke to several of George W.'s uncles, President Bush's brothers, that is, several close cousins, and they all kind of backed up this theory that I was looking at, that George W.'s whole life, in a way, was affected by that incident. The fact that he had to really draw close to his mom, and it was almost smothered, and then beyond that was burdened with an even greater level of expectations. He was, truly the first son and almost really an only child. It's so significant to me when you think about George W. And people have asked me, what's the most surprising thing I learned? What I learned was maybe the most evident thing, or I was surprised by what was just sitting there right under my nose. The guy's a dead ringer for his dad, I think increasingly so. When you walk into a room with the two these days, it's hard to tell the difference sometimes. But not only that, he went to the same high school as his dad. He went to the same college as his dad. At college, he belonged to the same fraternity as his dad. He belonged to the same secret society on campus, this very closed door and almost mysterious society at Yale called Skull and Bones. He belonged to that group as his dad had and as his grandfather had. Then beyond that, there were many, many other similarities. He was engaged to be married at one point in his life, at really the same juncture in life and career as his father had been engaged. He went into the same line of work, obviously first the oil game. And when he did that, he actually replicated the thing that his dad had done many years earlier. In 1948, the elder George Bush had jumped in a Studebaker and drove down from the northeast out to the wild and woolly outbacks of Midland, and where he was accused of being a carpetbagger, by the way, of kind of coming down to take his place in the oil game out in West Texas. George W. did the exact same thing in 1975. He jumped in a Cutlass, not a Studebaker, drove cross-country from the upper realms of the Northeast and went out to Midland, the same spot where his dad had tried to get started. And that set off a whole nother path of inquiry. I began looking at all these stations in life that George W. had gone to and had been in, and I began to measure his success, if you will, at those stations in life versus his father's success. And arguably, and I think this is borne out by a lot of relatives in the family, people who talk to me, George W. simply didn't enjoy the same level of success as his dad did, though they were on similar paths. So that said a lot to me, and I really kind of adhere to this almost Shakespearean view of George W. He says, I'm not a guy that walks around with a skull in my hand, and I'm not navel gazing, and I'm not worried. I'm very free. I'm very comfortable in my own skin. He says, I don't remember any heaviness, really ruining my life. I'm a carefree lad. These are all his words. But I really think that he's not so carefree. I had so many people tell me that in essence he really isn't, that he really is encumbered in some way and maybe challenged. Maybe that's a nicer way to put it, but he's motivated in good part by this legacy, this really incredible, powerful, and really almost quietly held legacy. We know so much more about the Kennedys. Their tragedies are played out, unfortunately, sometimes very obviously, and maybe they've had greater spikes of tragedy. They definitely have had greater spikes of tragedy in their lives and in their family. But there have been enormous challenging moments for George W. And again, I think the real way to understand him is almost sometimes not in a political way. It's really to think about his role in the family, the way he's responded to this almost crushing, to be somewhat dramatic, but almost crushing level of expectations that have been placed on him. I talked to former Lieutenant Governor Bob Bullock on his deathbed earlier this year. I was sitting around my house and the phone rang. I had been pursuing Bullock for a while, politely pursuing him to ask him for an interview. My phone rang one afternoon, 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and this really gravelly, intimidating voice, popped out of the phone. If you want to talk to me, you better be here in 15 minutes. And so I ran out the door, and I said, okay, that sounds like a command more than an invitation. But I really wanted to interview him, and So I hopped in my car and flew over to his house. Kind of lives very close to the state, or had lived close to the state capitol. I went inside, and it was a very, very powerful moment. And I think really in 20 years of journalism, I had never had a more powerful interview experience. His wife opened the door. She invited me in, said that he was feeling very ill. He had just returned from some form of either radiation or chemotherapy, and was just laid up in bed. And I asked whether it was appropriate for me to be there. Should I come back? I don't want to, be ghoulish, frankly. Should I come back? And she said, no, just pull up a chair. He could barely whisper. So pull up a chair. I sat very close to him. And for the next 2 hours, I just strapped myself in for what was a very powerful and really emotional experience. I almost felt like it was a deathbed confession to me, and I learned a lot of very interesting things about the way politics works, or maybe doesn't work in Texas, or the way the game is played, and we talked a lot. But the point I'm getting to is that he kept lapsing in and out of consciousness, and occasionally would emerge with a very incredibly clear point, and actually some other almost psychedelic points, if you will, to use a word. He was deriding Rosie O'Donnell at one point to me in really vigorous and very colorful language that's mentioned in my book for seemingly no apparent reason, it seemed at the moment. But at one point he said to me, every son has to dream out of necessity about their parents. And then he began talking to me actually in a very personal way about his own son and some difficulties that they had had in their own relationship. And he told me further how he had almost essentially adopted George W. Bush as the son maybe that he had never had. And then he further said to me, every son, even if they don't say it, probably wants to live up to their father's expectations in some way. And Bullock, again, I kept trying to excuse myself, asking whether it was okay for me to be there. And he said, no, I need for you to understand this. And he said, can you only imagine if your father was the president of the United States? None of us can really understand that. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine the burden of expectations, having to live up to that? At that point, that was really one of the last interviews that I did for my book, but I felt it was a good footnote. I felt that I had actually been on the right path, that was the right way to go. It kind of confirmed my instincts that it was better to take a more personal look at George W. than a political look, really. And I'd suffer the consequences of that. Again, a lot of people have said, not that there have been a ton of reviews, the book's only been out a few days, but in some of the reviews, people have faulted me again for not taking an acutely political look at him. But odd to say this about a very serious and somber moment with a man who would die several weeks later. But I felt better for what he had said to me. I felt that I had done the right thing in some way, and that this was the right way to write this man's biography, something that I took very seriously. I'd be glad to answer any questions or duck any tomatoes or anything else. I won't sing any songs, though. I'm not going to do that. Go ahead.
Have you done any other biographies?
No, I haven't. This is my first. Yeah, it was my first. I'll tell you what.
I was asked if he has done any other biographies.
No, I have not. And I'll tell you what I'm not going to ever do again. I'm never going to write a biography about a guy running for office. I learned a lot about, frankly, what I normally do for a living. I'm a daily journalist. And I learned to maybe not like what I do, really, in the profession at large, mainly because I saw things written about me, about what I was doing, where I was headed, that were, flatly incorrect. So beyond that, this book started out almost innocently, I guess. When I started, he was, quote, just the governor of Texas. And I really went into it with that thought in mind. I can honestly tell you that I didn't know at that point. This was, May of last year, May of 1998, and he had not yet announced officially that he was running for the presidency. There's a lot of speculation, but in conjunction with my editor, who's a very good editor in New York, we had decided that, again, that would be, that would be an interesting development if that happened, and it turned out that way. Writing a book about a guy who's running for the presidency really on the fly as his campaign is developing, as his people are trying to position him and sculpt his image, and then other people are on the hunt for information about him, and on the hunt for all kinds of information, became a really daunting task, because I actually became a news story. People were scrambling for information about George W. Bush, and I became a news story. So it was kind of uncomfortable for me. Probably a real good cautionary tale. I learned a lot more about what I do for a living, and maybe why some people have pretty strong feelings about the media.
Yeah, Bill, I'm a member of the media. I'm Robert Draper at GQ.
Hey, how you doing?
It's good to meet you finally.
Good to meet you, yeah.
Two things. One, you mentioned Barbara Bush and your speculation that she had suffocated George W. I didn't see where you were going with that in terms of how that produced the man that we know now.
Oh, yeah. George W.'s got a line, a really famous line. I know, Robert, you've met with him and you've written some really good stories about him to flatter you here publicly, but you have, and in fact, one of the definitive stories about him, I might add. You really have. George W. says, "I got my daddy's eyes and my mama's mouth." And it always gets a laugh wherever he delivers it. It's a pretty good campaign tool. But I think he's accurate. He's right. He's honest. He's a dead ringer for his dad, but he has a needling way about him, as you know, and an irreverence about him, a bluntness about him, forthrightness, you might say, and maybe even a bit of combustible nature about him that a lot of people in the family tell me is really much more like Barbara Bush. And I think he got that in that period when she began drawing him closer. And one of his uncles told me that in the 1950s, the elder George Bush was really almost an absentee father. He was trying to make millions in the oil game, and he eventually did, as you know. And he was, in the words of Jonathan Bush, the elder George Bush was hard running. He was away from home a lot. He was down in Houston. He was back in the Northeast, trying to raise the capital to punch holes in the ground, and almost effortlessly really raising the capital in the Northeast. He was going to other family members and bringing back some investment money. But even the Little League coach kind of verified this. He essentially pointed out to me that Barbara Bush might have been the world's first soccer mom, in the sense that she was the Little League mom. She was the one who showed up at all the Little League games. And not the elder Bush. So he became more like his mom, I think, and I think that in some ways, makes him a better politician. He's certainly less stiff-backed than his dad, and he's more gregarious and charismatic in some ways, in a retail politics kind of a way, the grip and grin kind of a way. He moves easier in crowds, more like his mom than his dad.
The second question is far afield from his family. Have you gotten a chance to take a look at the afterword of Hatfield's book, and what do you make of the allegations? Yeah,
I know what you're referring to, and for everybody else here, there's another book out just recently, in the last few days, called has a similar name to mine. It's called Fortunate Son. And it's been getting some level of interest and maybe even notoriety, lately. I haven't read it. I haven't seen the afterword. Some colleagues of mine, very capable research assistants of mine, have read portions of the afterword to me, and that's really all that I know about it. I know it's embroiled right now. I mean, literally as we speak, in a little bit of controversy.
He cites three sources. He does not. He doesn't name the sources.
Yeah.
Who indicate that that Bush in 1972 was busted for cocaine and did community service for it, and that community service was Operation or Project Pull.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. He's and that's the same story that I've heard, that he this particular writer has suggested that George W. had to go into a form of community service, perhaps at a place in Houston called Operation Pull, which was an inner city anti-poverty agency. A mentoring program that was in the 3rd Ward of Houston. It no longer exists. One thing that I'm proud of on my book, and to pat myself on the back, is the level of sourcing in my book. I was trying to count them up earlier, and I lost track. I'm not a good counter, but there are 500, 600 footnotes in my book. It's very well sourced out, and I can really credit a guy sitting right behind you named Mike Smith, was my lead researcher on the book, an extraordinary and very capable researcher, for flogging me as we wrapped up this book. And, Bill, we need to resource, triple source, get every source down here possible. And I thought I had done a pretty good job till Mike pointed out that it wasn't up to his standards. So, but I owe him a great debt, actually, for urging me to do even more sourcing than I had felt comfortable with. I think he was cognizant, probably in a more political way than I was. The stakes are very high, right now. And this book, in an odd way, in a very specific way, is now almost a political entity in itself. And I'll tell you this, I'm damn sure glad that we sourced it as we did, especially in light of some of the things that are cropping up as people talk about other people's books and whether there are enough sources in it and are they identified and so on. I think named just about every source that contributed to this book. I think it's very, very clear where all of the information in this book comes from. I'm not sure if I answered your question.
Only insofar as I was curious whether or not that had any ring of truth to you and whether or not along the way.
Yeah, I'm sorry. And, and I do want to answer that. Yeah, I interviewed, here's the way I'll do it. I interviewed, I wanted to know a lot about Project Pull. It's pretty interesting to me. I know the Third Ward really well. I used to live in Houston and worked at the Houston Chronicle, and one of my duties over the years in Texas has been to write about poverty in the inner city and social services. That's really my area of expertise. So I know the Third Ward. It's a less affluent area on the outskirts of Houston, and I'm sure some of you here know the area. So I wanted to know about this organization and why the heck George W. Bush would be working there. What's a guy from the other side of the tracks, the more affluent side of the tracks, doing there? So I exercised what I thought was proper due diligence. I found one of the co-founders, kind of hard to find. I found him deep in Louisiana.
Ernie Ladd?
Ernie Ladd, exactly, yeah. And I asked him, it's a former professional football player named Ernie Ladd. I asked him, Big Cat, Ernie Big Cat Ladd. And I asked him why George W. was there. And he flatly told me that he was there because I was friends with his father. And his father, wanted to get him a job. He thought it would be good for him to be working in the inner city, get exposed to, different things in life. And it was good for him. He was a very blunt guy. He said it would be good for a white guy to come to a black neighborhood, I also discovered in my research that George W., 2 years before he went to work for that organization, was thinking about running for state representative. George W. likes to essentially suggest that I came late to politics and that it kind of occurred to me a little later in life, but really as early as 1971 he was thinking about running for a significant office. That state representative district that he was looking at happened to be pretty close to where Operation Pull was headquartered, and it would be very in keeping with the Bush family's political expediencies and their way of studying things and knowing when to make the right move. It would be a good idea to go to work in an organization like that, build up your civic resume, be seen in the neighborhood, and maybe position yourself to run later. I also interviewed the guy who ran the program, a guy named Edgar Arnold, who turned out to be one of George W.'s good pals during that juncture. I also interviewed another guy named David Anderson, who was one of George W.'s co-workers. I interviewed David's wife, who also worked for a time at Pull. So I interviewed 4 people at this little tiny inner city mentoring agency and asked them point blank, was George W. here as a condition of punishment? Was he here because he had done something bad and was ordered to go here? And I told him, I said, probably, I would think that. Why would this guy be here? He doesn't have to be here, and he really didn't have to be there. His parents were quite affluent at that time, and they all told me that he was just simply there really at the request of his father, and that request had been, my son needs to be exposed to other things in life. It would be good for him. Of course, I extrapolate a little further. It would be good politically. It really would be good politically. And George W. has made reference to working there over time in different campaigns and at different junctures to tell people who criticize him for the thought, well, gee, how do you know about life on the other side of the tracks? You were never there. And now he's able to say, well, I was there. I was on the other side of the tracks. I worked there. So again, I'm not sure if I completely answered your question, but that's what I learned about that episode. I can tell you, you probably want to buy the papers over the next couple of days. There are going to be a lot of stories. I got a lot of phone calls today. Just driving around.
Me too.
You did too. Very dramatic. The New York Times, the Washington Post, a lot of other people, CBS Evening News, a lot of people were calling me today. And again, I honestly have not read the guy's book. It's here in the store. I saw it on the way in. You might want to, pick up a copy.
Already did.
You already did. Yeah, I'm going to get one. And
The dramatic stuff you're talking about is stuff that's in that book that's being reported on by the Times and the Post?
well, as I understand it, the Times and the Post are both working on stories about that book, just its existence, and they're working on stories about the writer, and even. And again, this is extreme speculation at this point, but my understanding is just about the fate and future of the book itself. What will happen to that book. So, go ahead.
Recently, Governor Bush made a speech, or he made some remarks that were critical of the Republican leadership, and he
Sure.
used the phrase slouching to Gomorrah, which I recognize as being from a book written by Robert Bork, who had been a Supreme Court nominee. And I was just curious, has the governor read that book? Have his advisors read it and maybe give him like a condensed version of it? It's a very deep philosophical book, and, I like the guy, but he just doesn't
Sure.
strike me as somebody who would read something like that.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know whether he's read that book. I can tell you, almost as a kind of a journalistic technique, I began trying to ask a question in almost every single interview that I did. My editor had a great suggestion to me at one point, which I initially didn't like. He said, why don't you ask people what George W. Bush's poetry is? And I understood immediately what he meant. What's in his core, what's in his soul, what really motivates him. Is there a particular piece of music? As I write in my book, is there an aria? Is there a melody? Is there a piece of dance, a piece of choreography that he saw that stirred him? Is there literally a poem? Is there a book? Is there it's something, just something that's, all of us, I think, have something that stirs us. It could be another person, a sport. Maybe it's baseball. He loves baseball a lot, and maybe he sees a form of spirituality. This is where I go into the psychobabble land. I disappear into the land of psychobabble that George W. maybe doesn't like so much. But I thought that was pretty interesting, and it kind of fit in with what I wanted to do. So I began asking people, really as an exercise in getting to that question. I thought the right way to do it, or a good way to do it, one form of doing it, was to ask what books George W. likes to read. And I also asked a lot of my researchers. I had the benefit, again, of working with a crew of extraordinary researchers, again, to flatter the best one, Mike Smith, who's sitting in the back row. He was really my principal and lead researcher. But I had the benefit of working with other people, and I asked all of them, as they did some work for me, try to find out what George W. reads. I became really almost obsessed by it, and I have to tell you that not many people were able to answer that question. One day I was over in the state capitol, and I was summoned into the office of George W.'s press spokesperson, Karen Hughes, and she began lecturing me really about the number of books that George W. reads. It was really almost a spontaneous lecture, if you will. It was like being summoned into the principal's office suddenly, and I understood it really to be a response probably to the fact that I had been asking a lot of people in the family and just elsewhere that same question. And she said to me, George W. reads a lot of books, and he reads, and of course, which ones? And well, he's read the biography of Teddy Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, and he likes mysteries and so forth. So I'm being very honest. That was really the first I had heard that, and I really did try to ask a lot of people, just point blank, is there a particular book perhaps that stirs him? Of course, I'm being a little funny now. I hope that he's read my book and has some feelings about it. I think that he has read it, but I don't know.
In your writing, did you find out, was he connected in any way with his brother Neil's involvement with the savings and loan scandal in the 80s and the big,
Yeah, no, the Bush family is extremely loyal. That's another amazing facet of the family. George W. has a saying, you have to be willing to throw yourself on the grenade. for the family, and really, for my father. It's an amazing. To me, it says a lot. It's almost a combative and warlike fealty to the family. Very, very loyal. So he was with his brother Neil. It's in the book. George W. at one point said Neil is getting hosed. That was the word that George W. used. Neil is getting hosed, primarily because he's the president's son, and he's the victim of a media backwash and just this resistance, the media and other people attacking our father. In terms of a real technical relationship in that regard, it was a pretty widespread collapse of a savings and loan in Colorado. I didn't see any direct connection. There's a really good book simply called Silverado that was written by somebody, I think at one of the Denver newspapers, that really examines that whole event in great detail. It's a real good book. Go ahead.
Couple things.
Sure.
Ultimately, he didn't cooperate, right? Did you hear that? Who did you hear that from? Karen Hughes or one of the lieutenants?
Exactly. Yeah, I called religiously. I really did. In fact, I kept a log for a while of the number of phone calls I would place over there. I really honestly wanted to, it's the right thing to do. It's just what I do for a living. You continue to ask for an interview, and then when you begin interviewing other people, you go back to the original sort of subject and ask them to respond to what other people have said. So it's kind of due diligence, I guess. I lost track again. I could probably say it was hundreds of inquiries via fax, letter. I wrote personal letters. I made numerous phone calls, and in my acknowledgments, I actually thank the recipient of all my phone calls, a long-suffering member of a staff who had to endure, my voice, pleading, cajoling, whining. I tried all kinds of different approaches, and really just sort of how I was doing that day. But no, we never met again. What's interesting to me, I was never officially told that we would never meet again. I did, establish. I did get some form of an answer, and the answer was that he's still weighing whether to meet with you again, whether to grant another meeting, and almost as an exercise in, I don't know, kind of for my own self-interest on the week that I was going to that I had to finish up the book, that I was contractually committed to delivering the book to my publisher. I decided yet again that I would try, one more time. The book was done. It was pretty much done in a little box. We were feverishly running around fact-checking and sourcing again. But that week, I decided I would try again. And I was told that week that he still really hadn't made up his mind. So I envisioned myself, flying down to the FedEx at 8 o'clock at night, which is how my book got delivered to New York in real dramatic fashion, maybe stereotypical fashion. That I would be, scrawling something in pencil in the margins, right there in FedEx, filling out the FedEx form with one hand and writing, the ending to my book, or including some thoughts from him with the other, since I had just talked to him on a cell phone, but it didn't work out that way. So,
I wanted you to talk a little bit about the hardball gig. What was that like?
You're referring to my appearing on the Hardball show with Chris Matthews, yeah?
Being interrupted by him a lot. Was that
yeah.
I mean, you feel like you've arrived now?
Well, I think I was delivered somewhere. I don't know if I arrived anywhere. I think I was launched to outer space. I talked to my wife. She, I think, she's been watching me. I've kind of refused to watch. I sound like a movie. I don't want to watch my performance. But I actually, my wife told me, she said, I don't know who you are, in essence. I'm paraphrasing, but it's not the guy that I married or lived with. You look like you drank, 800 cups of coffee. I became too much coffee man at that point. And it was really because I was just hanging on to his jet ski. My foot was caught in the tow line, and I just began talking really fast. I have no idea what I said. Actually, I did. It was funny. I went back to my hotel room. I had 15 interviews in one day, and that was one of them. That was and most of them were televised or taped for television and or radio. So they were very. It was kind of an intense, long day, and I went back to my hotel and was really almost passing out. And I flipped on the TV to just sort of calm down and maybe watch the end of the ball game or something. And whatever. And there I was. Of course, it was great. You know, it makes for a good story now, but there I was on Hardball. They were replaying the episode, and even I couldn't understand what I was saying. I had no earthly idea what I said. I just strapped myself in, and it was fun. He's actually a really nice guy. We talked afterwards. I'll tell you something really funny. I think it's funny. Anyway, I think people do this here in the store, too. It wouldn't surprise me if they do. This was in Washington in a bookstore. I went in because I had a spare 10 minutes, and I went in to look at my book on the shelf. And so I just thought that would be a fun thing to do. And maybe, you know, if it wasn't displayed, just, you know, I'll move it over there, over in front of the Edmund Morris book. You know, I just do that. So I'm doing this, or thinking of doing it, and I look over my shoulder, and Chris Matthews has just walked in the store. And I something told me, just step over here around the corner a little bit. Let's take a look. And Chris went right up to the counter and you know, essentially said, you know, where's my book? Because he had written a book, and he was really there to do the same thing that I had just done. So I felt pretty good about that he was there to check on his book and maybe, you know, sell an extra copy just by being there. So he was a very nice guy. That was an incredibly intense experience. Yeah, very intense. I only probably outpaced by having to appear on a show with Oliver North and Paul Begala. They have their own also political affairs show, and that was also intense, and in many ways more intense. So, yeah, thanks. Mike, my estimable researcher, Mike Smith.
Just wondering, did Governor Bush give you any kind of special nickname? And I was also wondering what Karl Rove's nickname was.
These are leading questions being asked, but they're good questions, and I'm glad you asked them. And we'll speak later about your health benefits. In fact, there won't be any. Yeah, actually, over time, you know, Governor Bush, one of his hallmarks, and actually one of the things that people maybe suggest that he does too much of, is grant people nicknames. He loves nicknames. Robert, you might have one, I don't know. He might have endowed you with one. You know, he started off by calling me Billy Boy. And over time, I began noticing that he's got a lot of nicknames for people. And, you know, he calls his friends a Spider or Weedy and Rodan, Big Chief, a lot of, you know, names, and a lot of them have interesting, you know, derivations and reasons for being. I was told by a very close advisor of his, one of my really good sources in the book, and a guy that I mention a lot and attribute a lot of things to. He said, you know what they're calling you these days? They're calling you mononucleosis. And I said, well, that could be read, you know, again, many different ways. I never had mono, but I knew people who had it, and it was almost, you know, it's kind of a comical, you know, it's obviously an illness, but it, you know, people sometimes laugh about it, you know, contracted from kissing. So what did that mean? You know, what was the symbolism of that? It also makes you sleepy, and I might be wrong on this. So, you know, is that a forecast? Is that a pre-review of my book? This is going to be a sleepy book by a sleepy guy. Is he a kiss-up? Is he a kiss-off? I didn't know exactly what it meant, and I even thought perhaps it was a corruption of my last name, which is very hard, Minutaglio. Maybe a lot of people, when they say my name, they start off strong and then begin to fade. They get Mina, and then I thought maybe mononucleosis. Maybe he finished my name with a different way than it normally ends. Mike also asked about a nickname that is applied to his principal political consigliere, his main political advisor, a man named Karl Rove, who some people in the room might know, a very powerful political figure. I maintain he's the Lee Atwater of Texas, and the guy in some ways that's credited with being maybe the person who's directed George W. to a lot of books and has advised him on things to read and look at. But his nickname, I was told, and I was told this by a pretty high-ranking official in Texas, is also quoted in the book, that his nickname was Turd Blossom, and that it has a lot to do. Oh, yeah, that made me curious. What did you do to deserve that? Is that good or bad? That's beyond mononucleosis in some ways. And what I heard was that it has to do with the fact that wherever this guy goes, stuff is sure to pop up. Stuff is about to happen. Maybe some stuff will hit the fan. Just things happen, and so that's probably one of the more colorful nicknames inside the Bush camp, as I learned it. Thanks a lot. Oh, go ahead. You got something else real quick?
People in these states back east, do they realize how little power the governor has? He's mainly a symbolic, ceremonial person here in Texas.
No, that's a good question. I spent a lot of time in Washington and actually just talking to a lot of the the real talking head guys up there whom you think would maybe know some of that or had checked into it a little bit, considering where George W. is right now. They were kind of surprised, frankly, that when I explored that with him a little bit. Yeah, constitutionally, the governor's office here is not an enormously strong position compared to maybe some other states. And it's been described to me even by the Speaker of the House and former Lieutenant Governor Bullock as a place that calls for cheerleading, a lot of salesmanship, kind of a sense of cajoling and getting people to work together and building a consensus and things like that. And I maintain in my book, I flatly stated that those are skills that George W. seems aptly suited for. He literally was a cheerleader in his life. He doesn't like to talk a lot about that. It's, as he says, being a male cheerleader sometimes doesn't sell too well in Texas. It doesn't go over too well maybe in some quarters of Texas. And he was the head cheerleader at the all-male private school that he went to, Phillips Andover Academy in Massachusetts. And he was a salesman in the oil game when he first started out. That was really his job. It was to kind of sell people on deals, get them to invest in this particular piece of land, and also to get ranchers out there to essentially sell him some land too. So he's kind of a middleman broker, and those are skills that are good to have actually in Texas. But yeah, you're exactly right. I don't think a lot of people know that that's the way. That's one of the political verities of life in Texas. Yeah. Thanks a lot. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead. Sure.
Elizabeth Dole made the announcement. Was it yesterday that she was withdrawing?
Yeah, sure did.
I read that as having quite a bit of bitterness at the amount of money. I'm just curious how
Oh,
you,
yeah.
how you,
I don't know
how you
that.
read
I mean,
that.
she might, I don't know whether she is bitter or not. I can't answer that. But, obviously he's got a lot of money. And I do know that some of the candidates have expressed that, he's got more money than the 60 million plus in his war chest, more than, maybe some of the gross national products of some small countries. So, yeah, there's some sense that they're being, washed over by an enormous tide and financial tide, and that's really the underlying reason why she dropped out. There's just too much money that she's stacked up against. Yeah. Go ahead.
I have a question about that, actually. I saw an interview today with Elizabeth Dole, I think it was on ABC or something, and she suggested that Bush started raising the money in '96. Do you think already then he knew that he was going to run for president?
That's a great question. Yeah, he'll say no, of course, and even when I was meeting with him, he was saying, he was kind of arguing with me. This was in 1998 in May and June. He was saying, I know the real reason you're here is you're convinced that I'm going to run for the presidency, and I said, that could happen. Certainly, that's a strong possibility, and of course it would make your story more interesting, but I don't know. And I think the wheels were turning, and some people, there's yet again to do free promotion for another book, which I'm not supposed to do. There's going to be another book. There'll be several more books coming out, including a very good one by Molly Ivins, in fact, that will talk a lot about the things that I have not talked about in my book, mainly George W.'s policies. Molly is Molly. If you know Molly, she's coming at it from a particular Molly viewpoint, and her book is going to be entitled Shrub. So I think you have a real feeling, for where she's going. But it will be a good, exhaustive and very colorful examination of her views on his policies. What I'm getting at is that there's another book in the works that I've heard about that might come out early next year, that speculates that George W.'s, I've heard this, and so I'm speculating here, but I've heard that this author will explore the thought that George W.'s real motivation for running for the presidency was to avenge his father's defeat, that he's all about loyalty to the degree that he's trying to exact some measure of revenge for his dad, being voted out of office. And George W. credits, blames, the media often and primarily for, quote, buying into Bill Clinton at the expense of his father. So I think he set the wheels in motion a long time ago. I don't know the precise date, but I think it predates his official announcement for sure. He's been thinking about it for a long time.
Do you think also there's a lot of coordination within the family, like with Jeb, for instance, with this whole, with the campaign and
coordination?
Coordination in the sense one is sacrificing for the other, and they decided in advance, it's his turn, and I'm going to wait.
Yeah, it's funny. I always thought you said ordination in the sense of there being this very planned and almost a hierarchy, and which would actually almost be an appropriate question. Yeah, there's incredible coordination. The campaigns when they were both running for governor in both instances, as Jeb running for governor in Florida, they were exchanging campaign information. They were exchanging tapes. And some of my colleagues who know a lot more about this than me, who really studied perhaps those campaigns, you would hear them say a lot of the same things. I mean, really almost echoing the exact same campaign slogans and promises and so on. Enormous coordination. They meet every August up in Kennebunkport, and they have what some members of the family call political conclaves. They gather and they plot strategy. It's not just a time to gather and be with the family and go fishing and play golf. A lot of the public things that we see, they go up there and they plot strategy. Politics is what the Bushes do. People in the family have told me it's in their blood, it's in their genes, and in a lot of ways they were born, as I say, really in page 1 of my book, page 2, that they were. George W., as an example, was born into politics in almost every way imaginable. It's under his skin. Go ahead.
I have a question. Before he was running for president, before it came out, is the Bush family much in the press, like up in the East, in Boston or whatever? And
meaning, were they
just in the general news,
covered,
like the Kennedys, are kind of embraced?
Yeah, no, they're not, and that was the real surprise to me, and actually a happy moment for me because that gave me something to write about. But no, there are two sides of the family, the Bushes and the Walkers, and I was just knocked out by the fact that the Walkers have just enormous, incredible roots in at all high levels of politics and commerce in this country. Going back to the mid 19th century, and not much of that has been written. They were. Founders of the most important brokerage firms in the United States. They helped to build some really monumental structures and edifices, places, institutions. Madison Square Garden, the Belmont Racetrack, where part of the Triple Crown is run. Brown Brothers Harriman, again, one of the truly powerful brokerages in the United States. The Bushes and Walkers are intimately tied in there, but you really wouldn't know it from reading the papers up there. I see that the nice man Jeremy from Book People is giving me the high sign, so
I just don't want to run out of time. Make sure everybody can get their books.
Sure, yeah, I'd be glad to sign any books if it won't diminish the value of the book, I think. So. Thanks a lot. Yeah. So we're into that, or not? Yeah. Okay, sure.
Slide.
Okay, well, thanks a lot.
Will you sign my admin warrants?
But yeah, I'll have to admit.